Yeah.
All right, it's 2:07. So let me start at 2. My name is Andy Deegan. I'm the head protection specialist for Austin Sargent. I've been there since 2008. Before that, I was an attorney, which is good, but I like this much better.
I am Jacob Farmer this year. I am currently a farmer at SCC Farm in Bradford, New Hampshire. And this last year, my wife and I, Cassie, she works at SCC Market, so you guys might know her. I started a farm on Hill Road in the south side of New Hampshire. And so this is going to be, I believe, my 5th year in the agricultural farming scene, and I'm here today about my perspective on farming and how working with conservation land is something that can help benefit the future of this field.
Yeah, and the land that he's farming is owned by Andy Jeffries. It's not conserved yet, but we're pretty close. So keep an eye out for that. So yeah, so we're here to talk about land conservation options. Unfortunately, my colleague from the farm site is here today. He was going to cover fee ownership of conservation land, and I was going to cover conservation land. But as an organization, when we first started, up until like in 2005, every single property we conserved from 2005 or conservation easement. Since then, actually since like 2020, we've gone from about 100 acres of conservation land that we actually own to almost 1,500 acres that we actually own. So the way we approach a project is basically from how the landowner sees it. So if a landowner comes to us and says, hey, we would like to put conservation easement on our property, that's how we approach it. But if they come for some reason, for that time, everyone is coming to us being like, hey, I want to give you this land. I want to, sell this land to you, and we were able to come up with a way to fundraise for that. How we approach a project really is determined by what the goals of the landowner are. First off, I'm talking fee and easement. So fee ownership is how you own the land. So you're responsible for taxes, you're responsible for maintenance. If there's an issue on the property, you're responsible for that. But conservation easement, Austin Sargent takes on an interest in the land. It's the development, it's the management. But the landowner still owns it. The landowner still pays taxes. If the landowner does a timber harvest, that money goes to the landowner. It doesn't come to Austin Sargent. We're just responsible to make sure the terms of the easement are upheld. And you still have the right to sell the land to someone else. All we ask is that you let us know, because if we're calling you about what's going on in the property and if you don't own it anymore, then that. So a lot of people ask, there are 2 things that people mostly ask, right? Is my land good enough? And it depends. My land, if I went to Austin Sargent or any other conservation land and said, hey, do you want to conserve this? They'd say no, because there's only my district in London is 4 acres and I own 3.5 acres. So my house is as much as you can do. But there are instances where they come to us and say, is our land good enough? It's only 1/3 of an acre, and they're like, what? This is something we want to conserve. The raspberry patch that's next to Spring Lake Farm, we have a conservation easement on that property. Because we went to the manager of Spring Ledge Farm, who had their raspberries at the time. That was and what we're looking at is a public benefit. And a lot of people are like, well, doesn't that mean the town allow the public to own the property? And not necessarily. So a public benefit, the IRS has all their rules, which are scenic use, value of wildlife, local government. That if your property has some of those attributes on it, then that's a public benefit. It doesn't necessarily mean public access. Okay, I know a lot of people are concerned about that, but I just want to lay that out. That being said, there might be some instances where we do need a public access. So when we're doing a project that's a donation, the landowner has a lot more leeway into what we can do. If the landowner says, I want to close the property against any and all public access. Great, you're giving this to us. We have these other, you have vernal pools on your property. Your property has ready for wildlife. You have really good forestry soil, really good agricultural soil. Great, we're conserving that. Just because the public can't go on the property doesn't mean there isn't a public benefit. Okay, so that's if you're granting a conservation incentive, donation. And so why would someone want to donate a conservation easement on that property? Well, you have a lot more control. It's a lot easier for a husband sergeant or forest society to say yes, because one of the things that we talk about it is, do we have to get money for this? And if we don't, that makes it a lot easier for us. But sometimes that's not possible for an individual. So the benefit of donating a conservation easement is you can get a federal tax deduction. This federal tax deduction was made permanent. So it used to be, it was, I think it was 20% of your adjusted gross income for 5 years after the donation. So now we're gonna get into the stuff where everyone's gonna like get tired and roll up. What is the value of conservation? So if you donate a conservation easement and you want to take a tax deduction, you have to get an appraisal of the property. These appraisals are pretty complex because the appraiser has to look at the before value and then the after value. So you're giving something of value away when you grant a conservation easement. You're not able to use the land as you can right now. So that's value you're giving away. And that value is tax deductible. So that appraisal is going to look at the before value and then seeing what you gave away, and there's going to be an after value. There's still going to be value in the land. So that difference is what you can deduct on your taxes. And when they made this the tax deduction permanent, they actually made it better. You can do 50% of your adjusted gross income up to 15 years into the future. But here's the but. You can't go over the value of your easement. So if your easement's value is $100,000 and 50% of your adjusted gross income is $50,000, you have 2 years. So the first year is 50, the second year is 50. That's it. Okay, so that's a consideration. We always tell you to talk to your tax advisor and an attorney that represents your interests, because this is a very important decision that you're doing. We cannot say, if a landowner came to us and said, you know what, I don't want the easement on my property. We can't just say, okay, that's fine. There's no longer an easement on your property. We can't do that under state law and under code. So there's that. In a situation where a landowner doesn't have the means or the tax deduction doesn't help them at all, there are situations, and it has to hit a higher bar, where we will buy the conservation easement. So when I said there's the full value, and then after the easement's put on the property, that difference, we can actually give you cash. It's harder. There are bigger hoops we have to jump through, because a lot of times we have to go out and get grant funding for that. The best grant in New Hampshire is LCHIP. If you're all familiar with LCHIP, you pay a little bit of money on each document that's recorded that goes into the pot. And unfortunately, fortunately, it goes to historical resources, but also land conservation. So there are a lot of people coming in and looking for that money, and many times the amount of grant requests is much higher than what they actually have to give for that given year. There are other grant programs for groundwater, ARM grants. They all come with their own strings attached. So the groundwater grants, you can't do agriculture on those properties. They're concerned about potentially reaching, if you're putting fertilizers on or something like that going into the groundwater. If their purpose is to protect groundwater, that's what they're looking for. So yeah, so each time, if we're looking at grant programs, there may be different strings attached. LCHIP, your property has to be open to the public for low impact recreation, including hunting and fishing. So if that's a concern of yours, LCHIP's not going to be the best way to go. But we have had many projects through LCHIP that were great projects, and they're going great. All right.
Can I ask?
Of course.
I think a clarified question. So the tax deductible option is if you are donating the easement to you,
Yes.
not if you're just putting the easement on.
But that
Not
would be,
timing.
if we're not giving you money, that's a donation. So if you conserve your property with a conservation easement, it's conserved. It's whether or not you're just giving it to us or if we're giving you cash for the easement. So if you conserve your land and we didn't give you any money for it, that's tax deductible.
Yeah, I've talked to people about easements, conservation easements, and one of the first things that they say is they talk about like the future. So say, for example, I just spoke to someone not long ago and she said that she's going to be, her children will inherit the property. She would like to see the land, she would like to see an easement, but she's concerned about the value. Does it bring down the value? So if there's an easement on the property, that's one of the biggest questions people ask. Oh, well, what does that mean? And does that devalue my property?
Yes, it does. And again, so when the appraisers are looking at excess property, they're looking at highest and best use, which is developed.
Yeah.
And so they're looking at the zoning, the highest value is industrial. So if you can develop it industrial wise, I think that's the highest value, but most of the time, the properties we're working on, it's residential. So if you can turn it into, several different residential lots, that's gonna be more value than if you can't do that. So if you're getting rid of that possibility, then yes, it is reducing the value for that person.
So would you say that, also we can look at it as the value of what an easement would bring to a lot of things.
Yes.
Natural resources, wildlife, etc.
Yes.
So, so I guess, you can look at it, it really is like, so for a resale, like, I think, oh, I would love a property to buy a property that has an easement on it. So.
Yeah, it takes a special
Yeah.
person, and we have a clause in the easement that says if you're putting it on the market, it says 10 days before the transfer, you need to let us know, but. We're your partner. If you're having difficulty selling your land because there's an easement on it, that's not good for us. Because people are going to be nervous about putting their land in conservation. So one thing we make available is, look, if you're, one of the questions where, I'll get to monitoring, but we monitor once a year. One of the questions our volunteers ask is, are you planning on selling the next year? And if they say yes, we reach out and we say, look, let us know and let your realtor know that if people have questions, they can call us. I've talked to people on the phone who are very nervous about buying a conservation property because I was like, well, what do you want to do with it? And they're like, well, I want to do, X, Y, and Z. I'm like, well, that's fine. You can do that on the product. Oh, okay. Because the landowner still retained rights to the property. You still have rights in your property. So yeah, they are giving value away, but sometimes there's value that's retained going forward. Like, people have different reasons for conserving their land. We had one person say, well, I'm conserving this to protect this land for me. For when I'm 80 and I need a house, the money from a house lot, I don't want to be able to do that because I love this land. And that's actually a side land. So, we have some people that it's just a financial decision, and that's fine. We have people who, they've managed the forest for a long time and they want to see it continue to be managed for forestry, and that's the reason why they do it, and that's great as well. So that's the hardest part, is to trying to reach people, is to come in with the angle that fits them the most.
I can't remember the study, Joanna, but there was a study done that looked at properties in easement and then market value over a period of time. And they actually tracked the market. In other words, for argument's sake, I had a big piece of property worth $1 million. I put some of it in easement, and now that property is worth $250,000. That $250,000 value of my property tracks the market. So it doesn't stay that forever, because I think you made the argument. People like to buy properties with an easement on.
So when you're taking a tax deduction on your conservation easement, if you own other land nearby, the appraiser has to take into account the increase in the value. Because if you're near conservation land, your land is more valuable. Because just think about it, why do we live here? I grew up on Long Island. As I was telling him, the house I grew up in was built in 1910, it is a farmhouse. And so that farm. When I was growing up, we had the biggest lot in the neighborhood at 1/3 of an acre. So that's where I'm coming from, that's kind of why I do what I do. But yeah, but a lot of people think that if you put it under easement, you can't do anything, it's hands off. And
Well, no, finish what you're saying.
okay. We stay away from the forever wild easements. There are organizations that do forever wild easements. And there's a place for that. I'm not, but where we are with the economy that we have working with it. And that means there are two types of commercial activity that can happen on the property, and that's forestry and it's agriculture. We do protect a lot of farms, we do protect a lot of woodlots that do have timber harvest on it. And fortunately, our stewardship manager, she has her master's in forestry, so she and her husband's a forester, so trees are what they do. So to have that knowledge base is really helpful, but the land is not locked up. If you want to do something on it, we want to make sure that you do it right and you do it sustainably and you do it in accordance with the plan of the property. But the land is not locked up.
Just another point, when somebody's thinking about putting an easement on, it is possible, and I know that's what Sergeant's done it, we've had the funds in town. If you think you have a kid or two that want to build someday, you can keep out. In some case, it's a 2 acre minimum, the 2 acres. 1 lot, 2 lots, whatever, from the easement, and then put the rest in easement, so it's not precluding, it's not all or nothing if you have a piece of property. Before you put the easement on, obviously, you tell Sergeant of Forces that, you know, this part you want to keep out of it. And then, so down the road, somebody could
That's
build,
exactly what we do.
yes, and it is what you did, right?
If we have 130 acres and did a minor subdivision. To which Jake and Cassie are gonna live on a little 7 acre next to the farm, and our daughter and son-in-law have about a 12 acre. Piece, and about the remaining 110 to 15 is going into conservation.
Yeah, and, okay, sure. The way we used to do it was we'd have the property surveyed and we put an X on it and say, we can take that out at a time in the future. We have guidelines as to how you can do that. You can only do 5 acres. You know, we evaluate by project, but then the IRS was like, yeah, no, that makes it a non-tax deductible conservation easement. You have to do 4. So if you're thinking, like, look, you know, my kid might want a house here in some point in the future. That's fine, let's carve it out now, and then if they don't, you can roll it into the easement. If, you know, that's fine. My goal when working with the landowners is to meet your needs, so long as there still is that public benefit. And then, you know, if something changes in the future, that's a different conversation. But again, you can do agriculture commercially and you can do forestry commercially. Those are under the IRS guidelines, those are permissible things, so we allow pretty much everyone to do that. So to talk about agriculture.
Question first, in order to carve out the little 2 acre lot or whatever, you have to subdivide it or?
No.
Yes,
You don't have to subdivide. You did because you're creating 2 house lots. If you're subdividing, if you are creating 1 house lot. So let's say you have 100 acres. And you want to 5 acres out of the easement. You don't have to do a subdivision. What happens is. And this,
I don't know that's true, I mean, how are you gonna tax it? Because that 5 acres is gonna be taxed at a building lot, and the rest will be at the current use rate.
right, but you're owning a property that's next to, it's not a separate parcel. And it's still
And
zero
until you build on it,
until you build on it.
then you would subdivide it out?
No, you wouldn't subdivide it out. You would basically say, the easement applies, this is survey, okay? So you have 100 acres. Then you have the 5 acres that you might want to build on in the future. The surveyor would carve that out, but it wouldn't go through the subdivision process. And when we do our legal description, we do meets and bounds at the end of the easement. We say the easement is on here, it's not on here. That usually we have that as what's called a deed restricted area, which just means when there's a house there, it can't be sold separately from the 100 acres, the remaining 95. So that's how we handle a situation like that. You don't have to go through town subdivision requirements and things along those lines. It's really just a paper subdivision. It's just on the survey.
But it would be taxed, I think, differently, wouldn't it? Because it's not under easement.
Once you put a house on it, yes, but it's like if you own. If you own 12 acres and adjacent to it, you own 1 acre. My understanding under current use law, they can all be under current use because they're abutting.
Right, as long as it's not developed.
The advantage area of the way you describe that, I agree, because I think. When I had that property, it was called the curtain line, which I can look up.
Yes.
Your name. The advantage is. From an easement perspective, you can't sell that little piece separate. It stays with the entire property. So if the person wants to buy the house. and it's not subdivided, we have to buy the whole easement with that.
And the reason we do, we're not gonna do that. So if there's a house associated with the property and it's 300 acres and a house. We're gonna allow you to sell that 300 acres separately, just because a landowner can make an income off of a 300 acre woodlot managed for. But if it's, you know, you separate the house off and then there's like 20 acres. It's more difficult to do that, and it may create more stewardship responsibilities or hassles for us going forward. That makes sense? So if you have a bigger piece that you can manage and say, oh, this piece, you know, this area of the property I'm gonna harvest in, you know, 2026, and this piece will harvest in 2029. With a larger piece, you're able to do that management of it and get some sort of income from the property. When it's a smaller piece, it makes that more difficult. So then we'd like to have a house associated with it, so that the value, you know, you don't sell the home, then you have 20 acres of conservation.
And so that kind of ties into the scenario that our farm is located on. So our farm is 110 acres on in South Sutton, and so the space that we're gonna lease is defined on the map as a 6 acre parcel. Benefits of that are is that now we are existing on easement property, we're still defined in easement. But we're still able to practice all of the necessary tasks that we need to be an agricultural space. I think we touched upon earlier in the discussion what the value of the land looks like. And I think you know that around the head that the value of the land isn't always monetary. And most people look at land as what is next to them, what surrounds them, and also what is going to be surpassing them in life, essentially, what is going to be a legacy. That is why creating a farm on conservation is super key. This is now something that can be next door and part of the community and also outlive me. So I guess to kind of step back a little bit onto where my story begins with all this. So I started farming in 2020 during the middle of the pandemic. I actually started as an intern at the Leesburg College and discovered right away how important it was that we need to have a better supply chain for our food. I think COVID-19, all the supply chain issues that we ran into, people started to have skepticism towards where their food was coming from and how it was being treated. 2021 was around graduating college, and we started working with Peer Started Food Hub, and my wife and I get an apprenticeship with them and learn how to farm. We spent a summer farming with Food Hub, and then eventually we get hired full time. I do how full time farming with them. Started once, 5 coming up. And that was not a lot of time for many people with me, but it's been a while. During that time, we started looking at where can we buy our own. We started searching land search online, Zillow. Started realizing real quick how tough housing market was able to do. Not only was it difficult to find land that was just wild land, forest or anything in this region, it was hard to find anything that you could eventually build on. And that was extremely discouraging. How are we gonna ever fulfill this dream of ours, especially on a farmer's salary? You know, farmers notoriously don't make a lot of money, so how are as a farmer going to be able to go out and purchase land? So we kind of were in a moment where we're currently renting an apartment 40 minutes from here, driving to work every day, and trying to take the next steps to fulfill this dream of ours. I would say that probably beginning of 2023 that we started having discussions with Andy and Dorothy about leasing land. And it was perfect. It's just down the street from where we currently live in. They can walk there if they want to. And it's going to be put into conservation. Because of that, it makes the land much more financially accessible. And so now we're able to lease a property. The big issue that farmers would like to do when they start leasing property is what do the terms look like? Most farmers are generational, they pick it up from their parents or grandparents. And the land has been worked, they know the history of it. And they know that they probably will have a generation after them that will take us after them. Currently, that is not the case in New Hampshire. The average age of a farmer in New Hampshire, I believe, is around 60 years old, and it's been increasing in the last couple of years. And a lot of the food in New Hampshire doesn't even come from the state anymore, so most of the food that we eat, I would say, I think the statistic is 3% of the food that is consumed in New Hampshire is grown in New Hampshire.
What was
So-
the percentage?
3%. So an increasing need to have more local food in New Hampshire. So this issue of having land inaccessible, but also having leased land not necessarily be sustainable, and I say that because a farmer that's on leased land for every yearly term, 3-year term, if it's not in conservation or if they don't have a relationship with the landlord, their term could end, and now their investment for the last 2 years is flipped upside down. You know, again, an average business can pick up shop, put it in the back of the truck, and move it into the town next door. On a farm, I can't pick up all the soil that I just invested the last 4 years into it, and leave it with me. Because you have to start over from scratch, and when your margins are so tight, that's pretty difficult to do. So when this opportunity to lease land, that's considered, we have amazing terms with the landlords and the system that we are coming up with. It's a dream trip. I think something that is really important to recognize is that value of that story, what I just described, can sometimes be much more than the land value itself today. Years down the road, the land's gonna appear value financially, it's gonna be worth more than it's worth. But the value that we're adding to the land, farming on it, feeding future generations, and hopefully, when Cass and I pass away, someone else can pick up the land and farm on it. And I know that's not going to develop that, which is great. Yeah, it just, there's so many benefits to it, and I think another important thing we might talk about too is that the land itself is not restricted to one use. I think it's great to show that you could be a landowner, live on the property, have a hay field in front of you, lease it to a farmer, and still have it in conservation. It creates a scenario of the land, instead of being a personal asset that you kind of hold tight, you know, do whatever you do with it. Now you're sharing it with the community, you provide opportunities that someone like Cass and I can now take off and support the people around us, and also support ourselves and create a future that in many ways isn't a new thing. This isn't, we're not reinventing the wheel. This people used to just be farmers back in the day, and now all of a sudden most of our food is being imported from elsewhere. And so it's kind of funny to say that we think of this as a new concept, but in many ways it's something that all of us, this is how civilization began. So that's why I'm excited to work with you guys moving forward and be part of this. And
Yeah, I think you're pushing it the right way. I mean, you know, his point of that he wouldn't put the effort in if he knew it could be taken away. You know, so if it's the landowner, obviously not you, but if the landowner who owned the land that he was farming could turn it into a housing development, you know, next year, why does he effort in? So you can attract the younger farmers who we're gonna need to come in and farm the land if there is a, that's under conservation.
It's more than just being conservation, it's creating a rolling lease. So that every year they re-sign the lease and they get another 5 years out, so that never can the rug be pulled out from under.
Yes.
I mean, that was taught to us by Greg at the Spring Ledge Farm, it's the relationship, the rolling lease.
Yeah,
It's essential.
we have, so we lease Master Farm to Greg, you know, they do all their road crops and everything in there. And our lease is a 10-year lease, just because he wanted that protection. And, I mean, obviously, he's been such a great partner, for us and with us, and, you know, when we asked, hey, you want to get a tour of the property to tell people what you're doing, he's absolutely open to that. So it's really been a great relationship. So, yeah.
Is that, just for clarification, for the conservation easement, at the Jeffries and the farm, is that farm section part of the whole conservation easement? Okay.
Yes. Yes, and our easements.
What's it?
It's 7 acres of the 110.
Yeah.
7 of 100.
Yeah, and our.
But it's all considered conservation.
Yeah.
Okay. it
And
doesn't-
our easements allow for you to lease to someone else
Oh.
to do something that you can do on the property. So since Andy can do agriculture on the property.
Yeah.
He can allow someone else to do.
Right, and it's amazing to provide this opportunity as a landowner, if you don't have the farm yourself. You can find is actually, an organization based out of King Hector, Land for Good, and they specialize in connecting landowners that have properties such as the one that we're gonna be farming on. And farmers are searching for it, yeah, it's an intermediary that provides them. And they also help work on these process, and like Andy mentioned, a rolling lease is such an amazing concept. The fact that every year you can create a term period that starts over provides so much security to go against what I was describing earlier, where the revenue pulled out from everything. And I guess I didn't also touch upon the benefits of having a farm present. Not only are you gonna have produce come out of the land, but you're also introducing a whole series of things. On our farm, we're planning on planting fruit trees, perennials, and whatnot. So we can turn something that's previously a hayfield, which is an ecosystem in itself, but now we can introduce more biodiversity locations. And so it starts to become a hotspot for anything. You can have so many people come by and pick your apples, it becomes a cultural space, people can walk around, be on a farm, going outdoors, has something positive impact, which is why people put that application in with. And it also provides more like financial sustainability to support the local, making that people come down to your area and also eat healthy food. So now the land just has so much purpose to it that it previously would not like that.
Well, the kicker for Dorothy and I was, we have young new neighbors, they're gonna take care of us. I think the youth that are here working and earning. And the motto with the Curbside Food Hub is, we don't just grow vegetables, we grow farmers, and Jake and Cassie are the proof of the pudding, but from our leadership perspective, we need to reproduce that model. And the fact that we can tie it in with conserving land in my mind is just sort of not ruining it. Farming is leveraging, to the full public potential. And that can attract money because people who are in a position to use the tax credits can then help the farmers get the land and start, it's a great story. And Dorothy and I weren't even able to take advantage of tax credits. It's not a simple thing, you've got to, but to us, it was, creating farmers and getting that 3% up to 4 or 5 or maybe even 10. I mean, imagine the resiliency of a community that actually prepared and ate its own food. I know that sounds crazy, but
Yeah, and
it's essential.
And the agriculture that's permitted on the property, you're doing row crops, potentially, apple trees, blueberries, maybe, I don't know. That's all permitted, but, you can also have beef cows, you can have chickens, and you can have things along those lines. And, I have chickens. I have a coop for them, and they still get eaten by stuff. So if I didn't have that coop, they'd last maybe a day.
Yeah.
So certain structures are permitted on conservation easements. So if you're doing agriculture, you can have a chicken coop, you can have a barn, you can have, the things you need to support that agriculture. We were talking earlier, and I was asking if there maybe sugar trees on the property. And he said, there are. So a sugar house is also a permitted use. So we have conservation easements that have sugar houses and they produce maple syrup. And so those are permitted structures on the property. So even though it's conserved, there is the potential to have structures on the property. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I mean, it's in order to support the activities that are going on the property.
The other nuances may be interesting to understand is that we as the landlords make the investments necessary to attract the farmer. So we will pay for the well, we will put in a slab for the cleaning prep station because of Jake and Cassie go on. We want to attract another, so we're trying to make this a farmable land.
That was my next question is if you have a farm, I know we're kind of getting off a little off, but
No, this
is,
is perfect.
is the, type of farming, you know, farming can have, you know, big ag, and use a lot of chemicals, okay, so. And this is also part of my question, like, so farming is gonna be, something that could be, useful with any, if someone decides to have their land in easement. And then do exactly what the Jeffries are doing, but is there guidelines as to the type? Then are you getting into the nitty gritty of the guidelines of the type of farming, because are you gonna get in, what if someone wants to use a ton of chemicals, which then gets into the groundwater, you know, that's what I'm saying, like, how do you then? Are you controlling that as the easement, as Osborne Trust, like, what, how is that all?
So they're getting organic certification.
They're getting, yeah,
No, no livestock.
they know. rules.
We're not gonna, we don't require that in our easements just because. The amount of work it takes, and there's an organization that does. So we're not gonna take that on.
Mhm.
We do require they use best management practices as from USDA and Cooperative Extension. We do require that they have a plan showing us what they're doing and when they're doing it and why. You know, we were talking about it earlier, he has to do that anyway for the organic certification, so it's just, here it is, there you go. You know, it is one of the harder things we get from people to do ag plans, because if you're doing forestry, we require a plan written by a licensed forester. And there are a lot of forestry now. There are no licensed agricultural people. You know, you have USDA, but the New Hampshire grows rocks really well. It doesn't really grow crops very well. You know, it's fortunate that we have the site that he's using, because that's a good spot, and it's being used for agriculture. If you look at the soil maps. You go down New London, you know, Main Street in New London, that's all the prime agricultural soil, and it's all developed. But it makes sense, because when people moved here, and it's like, oh, if my crops die, I die. They put it on the land. So that's where the development is. Fortunately, we do find it every once in a while, we can find the prime ag soil and we can conserve it. But yeah. Best management practices. So yeah, so they have these best management practices, we do like to see what they're doing. But there is a little more leeway with the agriculture, just because there isn't a group really behind it. And where I was going with this was USDA, we do like them to reach out to USDA. The problem is, because ag isn't so huge in New Hampshire, the turnover with them is really, really huge, and yeah.
And it's also just difficulty with that is even there's a very stark difference between a farm that's organic certified on one side, on the other, there's different application, like, different things you can apply to your soil that some people will, as even if they're organic certified as being synthetic or not, and that could provide source. And so there's actually like programs that go beyond organic to be more natural resources. But also the more ag that we do today, the more record keeping that we have to food safety standards and really mention the restoration practices, the recreation section becomes kind of a guideline. We don't necessarily have the space to do big ag here either. Any spaces that were not enough, we said are built upon or just to build it wrong, you have states, they're really going to do those boundaries.
And so, yeah, I mean, there are situations too where we had a conservation easement in a town, and the landowner had sheep and cows, and it had a street going through it. And technically, it's okay for the cows to go down to the stream for water. But they were not about the water, and one of the purposes of the easement was to protect the water. So we worked with the landowner to keep it away, we had another resource for the landowner to get water to their animals. So there are times when they are allowed to do it, but we will be like, look, there's a better way. Because, you know, you're putting all this silt down river.
And I realize, take this in India, but I really think the future of our state and of this region, this connection between conservation easements and farming is absolutely critical. Not just because it protects our cultural heritage and protects some of those regional farms when they will become developed, but just in my mind while you were talking, I quickly went through examples in this area of young farmers who started on easements. So I'll tell Greg is one of them. Mountain Farm, on Go Farm, the Kilsons, Worksong Farm. All of those spaces are young farmers who may not have been able to be farmers today if it wasn't for an easement. And so I think this idea of conservation easements and growing our agricultural economy is absolutely.
Yeah, and you mentioned places, so. Everyone's like, oh, it's been a conserved Black Mountain. I mean, it's unfortunate Brian's not here. And I was like, oh, that's in your region, are you like that? Like, that's, when they have success, I think that's a great thing. And for full disclosure, my wife's the VP of the Forest Society. So we talk about all these issues and everything, but you know, if you came to me and wanted to work on a project and you're like, you know what, I think I want to go with the Forest Society. I hope you have success. I want you to be happy with the outcome of this conservation project if you work on a conservation project. And if it's with Austin Sargent, that's awesome, because if we stop conserving land, you know, people might not, you know, give it to us anymore. But yeah, there are certain situations, and we also are partnered. We have a project in the southwest quarter of our region that we're working on, that Spinnet and Austin Sargent are trying to work together to conserve a really special piece, and we're a part. So if you walk out of this and go, I don't know, I didn't like Andy's shirt, I want to work with Brian, that's great. So just keep that in mind.
Hi, the Sutton Conservation Commission is very interested in trying to make wildlife corridors through much of Sutton. And there's definitely areas that are beautifully wooded. It would be ideal for wildlife corridors. Actually, Andy's property is one of them. And we have another person, Bob Wright, who's going to conserve the back of his land. It joins Andy's and Dorothy's property because it makes this wildlife corridor. We in our promotion of conservation and easements, we as the Conservation Commission, there are quite a few expenses incurred to have your land surveyed and have it the land value assessed. And then, of course, Osborne Sargent requires a certain commitment of money to make it so they can monitor your land in perpetuity. So what we do in the Conservation Commission is we pay for a great deal of those expenses. Often they're up to around $15,000 between the surveying and assessed value, and then of course Osborne Sargent. So this is our way of promoting people who would like to get into a conservation easement, but then the next roadblock they hit is the expense of just going through all this process. Anyway, we like to cover that cost.
Yeah, there are expenses associated with it. Some we can help you with, Osborne Sargent can. Some we cannot. So, and it's just because. So some of the expenses are survey. We want to know where the property boundaries are. And if we're doing that excluded area that we were talking about, we need that work done. If you have an existing survey, that's great. And you know, as long as we can find the boundaries and everything, perfect. We don't need to pay for a survey. The other is we do ask for a stewardship contribution. These easements are perpetual. They will not go away. We have a responsibility forever to take care of these easements. So we put money into our stewardship and our defense fund. Stewardship is for. Basically, we have to monitor the properties once a year. We use volunteers for that, but those monitoring reports have to be reviewed by staff. So. But then also, if someone is doing ag on the property and they're changing something. We need staff to go out there and take a look and make sure. Sometimes there are trees that are cut on. You know, the landowner's property, like a timber trespass, that we have to take a look at and come up with a remedy for that. We've had, I think we're on 2 timber trespasses right now, one Warner and one in South. So. You know, a lot of times it's an oopsie, but there's also, when the land changes hands, we need to talk to that new landowner. So if the person who put the easement on the property went through a process, they went through. You know, they reviewed drafts, they talked to their attorney, did all that. The next person coming in hasn't done that. So if they don't understand the terms of the easement, they might do something that's a violation of the easement, but it wasn't malicious, it was an oopsie. So that's what we do with stewardship, we review plans, if there are issues, we take care of those. The other expenses are going to be your attorney's fees. We highly recommend you have an attorney who represents you, look at the easement and advise you. Because they represent you, we can't pay for them. That's seen as we are influencing. So we can't pay your attorney's fees. On the same note, if you are getting a tax deduction for your donation of a conservation easement, we can't pay for that appraisal. Again, it's because it's seen as we are influencing that outcome. And there have been bad actors in the past. So if we are purchasing the conservation easement, that's part of our budget, we raise money for it. That's what we did. But if you're donating, if we're purchasing, we still can't pay your attorney. Attorney fees, no. Appraisal, only if you're donating, we can't. So the other thing, we can find sources of money if you can't afford to do that.
However, we
Never
will pay for them.
Never see lack of funds as a hindrance. We will find a way.
Yeah. no.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say that this Conservation Commission will pay for those expenses.
And it should be pointed out that those funds to pay for them are because people did develop land, well, it was current use, it wasn't a conservation easement, but it was open space, people had their land in current use. They decided to develop it, they get hit with a 10% tax of the value of the property, and that goes into the conservation fund. So it's kind of nice, it's like a full circle, and that money then can be used to help people with conservation easements on it.
Yeah, you know, the bottom line with this, and I'm sure there are things I'm not covering, but it's a relationship. It's a relationship between the organization and the landowner, and everyone needs to be comfortable in that relationship. If a landowner is coming to us and being like, look, I want to do this, 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 and this, we're like, well, no, you basically, you want to have your cake and eat it too. Like, we walk away just because they're not giving anything. But we also want the landowner to be comfortable. Like I said earlier, my goal with every conservation project is when the landowner walks away, they would say, I would do that because my goals were met and this land isn't going to be developed in the future. Are there questions?
Just go back to the agricultural. This parcel that has prime agricultural soil, is there anything in the easement that stipulates that this land would be used for farming in perpetuity, or is that only agriculture?
We try not to do that because we have, when we own the land in fee, it's much easier for us to find a farmer. But if the landowner buys it and they don't want to do farming, we basically have to go. And we try to avoid court, we're gonna go to court if we have to, But we try to avoid that, and we'd like to have the easements flexible enough where people can do things, but strong enough that resources are protected. So, again, it's like I said, we're not gonna say you need to do organic farming property, because it's just very difficult for us to enforce that. If we can't enforce it, what's the point? Like, so we had someone who wanted to put an easement on the property. And they wanted a provision in there that no insecticides, no herbicides. How are we gonna fix that? Like, there was a plant there the other day, it's not there now, what did you use to get rid of it? Like, we can't do that. You know, it's like when a property. You can put. So posting, if it's open to the public, if you're not allowed to post. If you are allowed to post for something, we say you're allowed to do it. We don't say you have to do it. Because there's specific posting laws in the state. And it would require the stewardship manager to drive by every day and be like, oh, it's not right, and then it's just not something we can do. So we try to make it so it's stuff that we can enforce. And that we're able to. So we typically don't require agriculture. We've had people ask that, and we've kind of been like.
Andy, if there are existing trails on the, so say there's a property and someone puts it in conservation through Alpine Trust, and there's existing trails there, okay, this is a hypothetical, and then say the land's an easement, but then it changes ownership. Okay, and the next person who owns the property, it's still under an easement. Does Osborne Trust, so say there's some logging done, does Osborne Trust, so you have a combination of, do they keep those trails open? Or is that part of their management of property? And then if there's logging by the new owner, and say the logging interferes with the trail, I just want to know kind of what your role is in managing the property.
So the landowner still has rights to land. For that, and one of the rights is most of the times is the ability to log.
Yeah.
So when we allow the public to use the property, we're not guaranteeing trail. Unless it's written. So most of the time, if we're allowing for the public to use the property, it's pushback. But there's potential for trails in the future. A lot of times we have the ability, with landowner permission, to put trails on the property. We've never done it, but we want the ability for the public to use the property. We have some. I did an easement with, at the time, the board chair in Goshen, and trail net all through the property. But there's no guaranteed right of public access, because he was basically like, look, if people are using it, I want to be able to post it right away, I don't want to do it for review. And that's fine, he hasn't posted it, and the trails are still there. But it's, you weigh the uses with logging. Didn't impact the lot, and it's gonna impact the trails or something. And things along those lines, you try to limit that, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. And the is able to do that logging, and we try to work with them to not make it over.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes in situations you try to work with the landowner. We had one in Danbury where they did the logging operation, and they didn't have to do anything to like work with the trails, and there's some snowmobile trails that went through it, but we kind of like. You know, it'd be really cool if you did this, and just explain it to them and just be like, look. Snowmobile did come through here, like, and there's some slash on there. If we can get your logger to move that, that would be really great, and they talk to the logger, and it's okay. And that's how we work with it. But sometimes we work with the landowner, it's not something they have to do, but we see the benefit.
What if it's specified in the deed though, that the trails, if there is logging, then trails have to be put back to a usable condition after, but that is specified in an easement. Then does that give you more or?
It gives us more leeway. Every easement is different,
Right, exactly.
so, and every easement is tailored to the land and the landowner.
This is my non-legal understanding for all the easement. If I have a piece of property, what I owe is not the land and the foreign rocks. What I actually have is like a bundle of rights, people plus 6. So I've got a lot of rights of things that I can do on my property. I can cut a tree as long as I do it legally. I can log, I can farm, I can do whatever. An easement is saying, I'm going to take my development right and I'm going to give that to you. And then in that negotiation, any other rights that we may negotiate, the right to cut trees on a certain place, or trails. So I still have my whole bundle of rights, except the right to subdivide the property and build other houses and do whatever we do. That's how I try to, that's how I try to say it.
It's one of those things.
Yeah.
That was property law. So yeah, so if you have utility easement that goes across the property, that would be a space. You know, so that's how you think about it. There are easements that go over all different easements that go over your property. It's big enough. Utility easements. They're going to be right away across the property. So.
If there's a piece of property that's had an easement on it, or a considerable, like, not 25, 30 meters. It'll change. And. Whatever reason. And. The better good, but. The population in general. The easement, it's certain to be eased up on, you allow different uses or whatever. For example, if 89 was to be built today, and it was excuse me, I should say, yeah, today. I have something right in here that would prevent it if they followed the gift that was made here. We would not have been able to root it, not to best extent.
Domain.
Okay, so. There's one, we say that easements are professional. And they are, except for one thing, and that's condemnation from a governmental organization. And so town, city, state, federal, basically condemn the property to put 89 through the conservation. That will trouble. We would fight it. And there have been situations in the state of New Hampshire where roads have been rerouted because of the conservation easement. But I mean, if it was 89, I think it would get pulled up through right there. But yeah, fortunately with Northern Pass, they passed a statute, I believe, that doesn't allow for corporations to do that, as if they can in other states. But we could not. We could fight it, but they could condemn the property to put through a road or, you know, something that isn't in terms of the easement. The easements are perpetual. There are times we have amended them, but we are fortunate in this state where the Attorney General has come up with an opinion that every easement, even if you don't get money for it, even if you donate it and you didn't take a tax deduction for it, they're all part of the charitable trust. So if you have an easement on your property and you want to fix something, the amendments we work on have mostly been to add acreage to the existing conservation easement, which is a low risk. But it has to go, any amendment, even if it's adding acreage, has to go to the Attorney General's office, Charitable Trust Division. They review it, and they might be like, look, we don't like what you're doing here, the rest of it's okay. And that will be a low risk, or they might say, you have to go to probate court, you need to get an appraisal to see the value change in this change to the easement, which is why we don't like doing amendments. I like them, like we talked about the other day, Henry, with that one property, where we're just adding acreage,
Yeah.
because that's a no-brainer. Let's keep the existing easement, so we're not monitoring two different things owned by the same person. We keep the same easement, but we just added 28. You know, we also did one. Our first easement ever was up on Berkeley Hill Road. And it was 6 acres. And they had to keep the view open. And the landowner wanted to use out to graze and keep the field open, so that the view of Mount Sunapee and Lake Sunapee remained. But the easement said no fences. I don't know if anyone who's working with cows. You can tell when we go outside of there. They will listen. But we worked with the landowner and we worked with the Attorney General's office to allow for fencing that looks exactly like the fencing that's across the street, that looks exactly like the fencing that's on a different easement. The goal was they didn't want the 6-foot solid fence that blocked the view. But what we got were some cedar posts with some barbed wire, which is totally in keeping with what you see in that area. And so that was a way we were able to work with that to solve a problem. And now we have their cow in Berkeley Hill. It's really cool. You drive up through there and, you know, there's tiny Italian, yeah. And it's really nice to see. I don't know if that answered your question, Don?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been reading about some other states where people all of a sudden, their family gave away land, the easement on it and stuff. And all of a sudden they were waking up and finding it out. Bulldozers in.
Oh, okay. That's different. That, so in New Hampshire and most of the East Coast, you own the top of your land and you own what's underneath it. So if you wanna, if there's oil down there, you wanna get the oil, that's you. Out west, to get people to move out there, they basically gave them the land for like pennies on the dollar, but only the surface. The subsurface is leased to oil companies, mineral companies, things like that. So you could have an easement on your land out there. But since you don't own what's underneath, the people who have those leases can come out and extract the leases. And I'm so glad I live in New Hampshire.
Yeah, right.
Not only that, there's also the water issues, like, it's just crazy. So I think that's more what you're thinking of, that can't happen. Unless, actually. There was a property in Sunapee where they're like, there was a person, they called me and they're like, I have a lease to mine mites. Do you want that? I would even want my. But yeah, that was a long conversation. We ended up not taking that lease, but that's the only time I've ever heard about it.
But they have put somebody else. Mine put.
Yeah, if the lease says that they have a right to mine and mica, then they can go in.
There are a number of
If-
4A and stuff.
If that is before. If they had their lease before the easement.
Easement, oh,
If it was after,
Yeah.
we don't know.
Yeah, right.
No. Yeah, because you cannot. There is a question as to what you can do with minerals on the property, the IRS is kind of, every once in a while, the IRS just, picks something and. A couple of years ago, it was, you can't, log your properties if it's under conservation. And that one went away, but now we've always said that, and this was what the interpretation was. Let's say you have gravel on the property and you want to make a woods road, you can use the gravel on your property to create a woods road on your property. It cannot leave the property. But now there's some questions there, but I mean, Tom Naslin, who retired last year, he was the #1 attorney for conservation easements in the country. And he was our attorney, so we get all the latest information from him, and the new attorney that we work with she worked under him for a year or two, and she's working in the conservation field. So we get all the latest and greatest things. But yeah. Yeah, well, if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Same here. But there are,
One question. Sure, so what if somebody has these lands and the difference between going to a trust? So if you have a conservation maybe, and someone comes to the town and says, look, I have land and I'd like to put it in easement for the town of Sutton. Or, can you explain the difference then between an organization like yours and the person wanting to donate land to the town under this? Because you're not really working with your ordinance, like, so people here are listening to you today. That would be going to Osmond Trust, would it? Now, I know you said there's other ways, but also through the town as well.
yeah, but we don't want to, I think, just have it with it, because that means that the town is responsible for monitoring it. All those different things that they do to oversee
Right.
their easements. The town has to, quite frankly, it doesn't happen.
Right.
Thanks for Bonnie and Donna.
Yeah, no, that's not me, and some people might wanna know the difference between the two, yeah.
yeah, there's definitely easements, that are held by towns. But it's a responsibility, and you have to keep an eye on it, you have to visit those properties. We do it once a year. But yeah, it's a responsibility you have to take on, and the conservation commissions that are in our region are amazing, they do great work. They do phenomenal things. There's rotation on them, and are you gonna have the expertise to do what's necessary for the easement? We hire people that, they hire me for some reason, but I don't follow that policy and law, you don't need law to do this job, absolutely not. But it has helped, we have Anne, who's forestry, she's excellent. We have Jeannie, she's done salmon research out in Oregon. She's worked at Springland Farm, so she understands the agricultural components of it. So to have that expertise, can help.
Yeah, that's kind of what.
And you
Yes.
can donate land, I mean, people have donated, but it's not with an easement.
Yes.
So, and then the town is allowed to do with it what they will, I mean, put it in selling it or just whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you can donate it specifically for conservation purposes, and that's a little layer,
Yeah,
as long as people are paying attention.
that's, paying attention is a big part, that's.
And, we've mostly talked about conservation easements, we do have field lands that we own, we pay the taxes on. We're an accredited land trust, so we need to meet certain other standards. And we also have policies as an organization on how we manage that. And if we dispose of it at some point, how do we do that? If, again, we'll go back to my house, if I donated my house to Osmond Sergeant, we would sell it for money and use that money towards the mission. But if someone had an important property that's for conservation, they gave it to us for conservation. We would manage it sustainably with their wishes. But they would be open to the public.
One other point that we didn't, I don't think we touched on is taxes that the owner of even of the conservation easement would be paying. It is the current use, but is it still, there used to be a better value if you had land under conservation easement, it was a little bit more of a break.
It's
I don't-
typical of current use, the only difference is if your property is under 10 acres, so if it's under 10 acres, it
Yeah,
can't go to
can't
current
go,
use.
but-
But if you put a conservation easement on it, it can go into the current use.
Right.
So,
No, you are paying minimal, you're not paying,
Yeah.
but the rest of us, they are.
yes, the towns look at it as, we're reducing the amount of tax revenue that comes in, but we're also reducing the impact on the town.
Right, services and all that
Cost of
side of
community
things,
services,
yeah.
there's a study. The best bang for your buck is industrial. If you have an industrial factory producing something, that's gonna give you the most tax revenue. Residential is one of the worst, because, let's say you have a 20-acre piece, and you carve it into 4-acre lots, and that's 5. 5. I did used to teach math. So when you think about it, each one of those homes needs protection from fire, protection from, police monitoring. And let's say each one of them has 2.5 kids that go to the school district. That's gonna be an impact, that's gonna increase the amount of taxes that your town needs to raise. And obviously, all live in homes, I live in a home, it's just this. Do we want it to be built out to the possibility that it can? Or do we want to save some of the natural places where we can go out and recreate? It's the reason why we live here.
Yeah, there was I read a study on they basically studied open space versus residential. And, I know you can get into other conversations, housing, all this, but I'm just talking about the difference between open space and residential for a town, tax wise. Open space is more cost effective for a town than having houses. Because of the cost of community services, towns that have more open space have lower. That's just a fact. But, it doesn't mean it's reality,
Let's,
And there's a whole other discussion to have about, and I'm not an expert on that. But, and I do see that, when you're looking at the houses that are coming on the market and you're like, $600.
I know for that.
But yeah, that's a different discussion, but if you look at the amount of conservation land we have. As opposed to what is still out there, I think there's definitely a way to work together with that issue. To get some land conserved, but also get housing. That's not our mission, I just wanna, because we've had this conversation in the organization. That's not our expertise. We do land conservation, land management, everything like that. If a developer were to come to us and say, we'll take care of this part, but we want to see this conserved. Excellent, let's do it. Totally open to that. But you deal with the housing, you don't deal with the conservation.
Well, like King, no.
Which was it? Yeah, but that was a situation that was perfect with that, and it worked out great. To have King Hill, to have those ski areas still loaded.
440 acres of open space we got.
That we added on to.
Yeah, right, that we added on to Bean and Little Leaf, right?
Yeah, I remember one of my first walks out on that property, of walking it down, I think it was the furthest south run. And I'm walking down there and I'm looking around like, wow. And then I look up in a tree and I'm like, that's a bear. And it was a baby. And it was the baby.
Oh,
And I went a little further, and the mom was right below us. And I ended up walking like two trails over. I don't think there was some.
Maybe we should just wrap it up, any final questions and.
Yeah, any final questions, if. I have some materials over there, my business card over there, if you have any, you go home, you're like, I wish I'd asked that. My email, phone number, everything like that's there, always happy to answer questions. If you're thinking about doing something. We have a whole PDF of a packet with a lot more information that we can send out to you, testimonials, but, you know, what the process is and what you need to know. So just let me know and I'll send it out to you. But yeah, any other questions?
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. You did.
Yeah.